Hey, everybody. Welcome to International Podcast Day 2019. I am Dave Lee, co-founder of International Podcast Day. Welcome again, everybody. I am joined by Ray. He is coming all the way from Australia today. Ray, how you doing today, man?
I'm doing fantastic, Dave. Thanks a lot. Congratulations on a successful day. It's been great to tune in all day.
Well, I appreciate it, man. And thank you for joining all the way from Australia this year. And we've had you on before and very happy to have you back. So briefly, before I hand the reins over to you, Ray, I did want to thank our 2019 sponsors. You can learn more about them over at internationalpodcastday.com/sponsors. First, our platinum sponsor is Blueberry, a full-service podcasting company providing podcast hosting, stats, and advertising opportunities. Find out more over at blueberry.com. Our gold sponsors, repurpose.io, automatically converts your audio podcast into engaging videos and upload them to YouTube, Facebook, and other social media channels. Try it out for free, repurpose.io/IPD. And Libsyn. Libsyn is a podcast hosting, distribution, and monetization solution for audio and video podcasters worldwide. Reach your audience everywhere on the most popular audience destinations like Spotify and Pandora. Check out more over at libsyn.com. And of course, thank you to our streaming partner this year, StreamYard. Cannot thank them enough for the support. And lastly, like to celebrate our International Podcast Day celebration supporters, Second Line Themes, Geeks Rising Network, Synth, Outlier HQ, and Focusrite. Again, you can find more of those information. We're going to get some free services and some discounted services over at internationalpodcastday.com/sponsors. Well, Ray, I am super excited. You are going to be sharing with us today the how to launch your podcast this week using the 6P's of podcasting framework. So I am going to get out of the way. Look forward to hearing what you have to share. And once again, thank you for joining us.
No worries. Excellent. Thank you very much. And appreciate everyone who's staying up super late for the presentation. I know it's quite late there, but it's only 5 o'clock in the afternoon here. So it is drink time. I have my vodka. But I just wanted to say thanks to everyone for making this such a great day. It's been very enjoyable. I myself, who've been around podcasting for several years, have learned so much. And it's so good to see that there's such a strong community in this space. So that's been really, really fun and enjoyable to watch. So my name's Ray Milidoni, and I started a podcast called The Razor Sharp Show many years ago. And in that process, I basically discovered this wonderful world of podcasting. And my life's basically never been the same. I also started a company called the Stay Sharp Group. And since then, I've also joined forces with who you just met before, which is Adam from Wavelength Creative. And so together, we are now working. And so this is a little bit of a way that my story went. One of my biggest themes is education. So whenever it comes to teaching, learning, that's my sweet spot. So it made sense to start a company called the Stay Sharp Group. And it comes from the 7th habit of highly effective people, which is always to sharpen the saw. And so we started the Razor Sharp Show. That was the podcast. And because we're so inspired by by what podcasting did, the doors that it opened, the conversations that we were able to have, we thought it would be really cool if we could inspire other people to launch their own podcasts as well. So that's when we started the Podcast Launch Co. And the framework that I'm going to show you today, which is basically like a 6-part framework that's going to help you launch your podcast if it's something that you've been thinking of doing, kind of came from the fact of us learning out loud and really making lots of mistakes and hoping that other people didn't have to go through that as well. And then about a year ago, I decided to package that up into a masterclass. And that was really successful because that was the first time that I was actually able to hold people's hands through the journey. And it was really special to see people show up every week and really share their journey with the podcasting, apply the information that they've learned, and then make a commitment to themselves that they're actually going to launch a podcast. And I was able to help them through that process and through the 6P's of podcasting, which I'll cover off soon. We also started the Melbourne Podcasters Group. So every month we would have a Melbourne meetup around podcasting. I met Adam at one of the awards night here in Sydney, Australia. And that's how Adam and I kind of basically got chit-chatting. The meetup kind of happened from that. And several years later, we are now working together in Wavelength Creative. So it's been a really, long journey, but really, really great just how all the pieces have fallen into place. And at the time, I was just wondering what a mess I'm creating here. But now to look back on it, it's quite reflective to see how all those dots join. So I'm really curious to know and have a bit of a chit chat with the people that are online. So if you've got any questions about starting a podcast, I know some people here may be experienced, and feel free to chime in with your tips and tricks as well. But if there's anyone in the room who's thinking of starting a podcast, then please enter them into the chat while we're going, and I'll answer them along the way. I do have a free gift. There is no opt-in. It's completely free. So if you want to download my workbook, which is going to help you through the 6P's of podcasting, that's available from the staysharpgroup.com/workbook. I'm not sure if someone can maybe pop that in the chat. Otherwise, I'll try and fumble around and do that as well through here. So as I said before, podcasting kind of really changed my life. And when we kind of thought about it, we really wanted to help as many people start a podcast. And we thought there's, kind of three ways that we could do this. We could do something where people could DIY it. We also thought that we could do a service where it's done with you. And then we also realized that we could do it for you. And so that's kind of like where Wavelength comes in. Like that, Wavelength is the agency that does the podcasting for you. We work with branded podcasts and businesses. But there's the stuff I'm going to cover with you today is really pretty much if you want to DIY it or do it with me through the masterclass. So I'll have a couple of offers at the end if you wanted to, work more closely with me, or you can grab my workbook and my framework and kind of do as much as you can apply yourself and kind of DIY it as well. What I find really interesting is that the way that people are listening to podcasts has really changed. Years ago, I would say that people would be distracted while they're doing podcasting, and they would be walking, cleaning, going to the gym. But what's been a big shift in the last, year or so is that people are really turning to podcasts as a form of entertainment. So they're actually giving their undivided attention to podcasts. They're really listening. They're not, even though they might be multitasking, they are really engaged and subscribed to the content. And I feel like there's no other, closer way that you can get to someone's brain than in their ears. So if you're able to have a conversation with someone while they're podcasting, it's really, really a powerful position you can be in. And it may be for different reasons. Like we've met some people here today that are really, trying to change the world in a positive way and creating impact. And I really do believe that podcasting is a way that you can amplify your message. And we heard before as well, Dave say that, everyone has an inner voice and a message that they need to share and give to the world. I truly believe that podcasting has the power to do that, to really share to the world what you want to share, teach, inspire, and is it just a real great way to be heard. And it may not actually be starting a podcast. It could even just be, building up the confidence to go on other people's podcasts and being a guest. And so while we're talking about starting a podcast, just really think about that maybe you can add a lot of value by being a guest on other podcasts. I know a lot of podcasters who are always looking for guests and so forth. But what's sad is that most podcasts never make it to, past 7 episodes. We heard the word thrown around a lot today, pod fading. And it's true, podcasting is quite hard. There's a lot of moving parts, technology changes, there's trends, there's a lot of noise. But think about all the platforms. When TV first came out, it was very niche, and then it became very noisy. Magazines did the same. Basically all mediums get really busy. YouTube, and yet YouTubers are making the most amount of money they've ever made. So when a platform gets noisy and busy, and when platforms start investing a lot of money in their growth and user experience, I think that's a really exciting sign. And we're just at the start of that. So I'm super excited to see where podcasting goes over the next couple years. A lot of people here are early adopters, and they've been around podcasting for several years, self-included. But I feel like this is when the magic's going to happen. So it really saddens me when I go onto a podcast and super excited about the topic, and then realize they've only released 3 episodes, or their last episode was 2-3 years ago, and there's no official goodbye message or a reason to why the podcast wrapped up. I think if it's part of your story to wrap a podcast up and move on to a different project, that's quite good. But it's really sad when a lot of podcasts don't get to see episode 8. So my main mission was to make sure that everyone that I work with always releases past podcast 8. So that was my kind of success metric. when working with clients. So the three questions I kind of get a lot when it comes to podcasting is podcasting hard? Does it take a lot of time? And will I make money from it? Is probably the number one question, actually. Everyone wants to know whether they can monetize their knowledge or, throw loads of lead magnets into their podcast and use it as a marketing vehicle. And I think that's the wrong approach. But to answer the question, podcasting is hard. Podcasting does take a lot of time. And yeah, you can make money from podcasting. But the opposite's also true. Like, podcasting might not be hard. And it may not take you a lot of time. And you may never make money from it. And so just to dig a little bit deeper into that, is podcasting hard? There are a lot of tools. There is also a lot of support. The actual process of getting a podcast launched, submitting it to iTunes, basically takes 5 minutes and maybe 24 hours of them to approve it. But what's really hard is the preparation, the thought, having the strategy, and making sure that you set the podcast up with a really strong foundation and some pillars for success. And I think now there's the most amount of support, but sometimes that can be overwhelming. You watch one video and it talks about this microphone, then you watch another video, it talks about a different microphone, and then you just get kind of confused. And there's a billion courses online, and I've added to that noise. Like, I'm guilty of creating content that tries to help people, but in the big picture may even kind of distract them. And that's why I really felt like having a mentor and someone that can hold your hand through that process was actually really, really powerful. The other trend that we're starting to see now is the done for you editing services, which are great. And there's a lot of people you can outsource this to as well. But some of the keywords that I've been hearing on the presentations throughout the day is, consistency and quality. And I think those things go a little bit out the window when you lose control through that. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to personally be doing the editing, but you need to know how it all works. So that way you can lead and manage someone who's doing it for you. So I think it's really important to get your head around how the editing works and even do a couple yourself before outsourcing that to someone else. Does it take lots of time? Yes, it can. Depends on how long your show is, how frequently you publish. And of course, initially, it's going to take you a lot longer because there's a learning curve that needs to come from that. But when I first started doing podcasting, it was very clunky. It took me lots of time. But I then built in some efficiencies. I automated using Zapier a few different things like booking guests and sending them reminders, and used calendar apps to manage my time. So it made it very easy not to have to go back and forth with people to book it. I also embraced batching. So I would do all my podcast recordings on one day, back to back. I know John Lee Dumas is very big on doing that as well. You get into flow and just record all day, but not everyone's built and can do that. So you got to find what works in your groove. And also, if you're not going to be an interview show, then all those things don't matter. So then you got to think about, when are you in peak state? Is it better in the morning, weekends? When if you're recording at home, when's the house empty, just noise free, and things like that. So it can take a lot of hours initially, but as you start training the brain and you get a lot more efficient with it, that kind of does reduce down. And I know when I was doing my podcast and with working a lot of business owners who do podcasting, around about 3 hours a week, once you get really efficient, can kind of cut it. But that's a best case scenario. I think you really need to invest a little bit more if you're going to polish the show and give it the quality that it needs. Especially now, listeners are a lot more fussy when it comes to audio, background noises, bad edits and breathing and pops and things like that. So we really need to make sure that we give the listener, who's the number one important part of the whole podcasting experience, a really good experience. And will you make money from it? Well, some podcasts do, but let's face it, most don't. So you really need to understand what your strategy is for. I've seen so many people in marketing and business who launch a podcast and basically just copy everything they do on their webinar funnel and put it onto like a podcast and think that they're going to get the same opt-ins and the same subscribers and things like that. And I think you just need to really understand what your strategy is all about and why you're getting into podcasting. And that, podcasting should be really used as a way of creating authority around a particular topic or industry. A great way of like building and nurturing relationships and connections, and again, to amplify what you're already doing. So it should be a supportive part of what you're doing, or belief. If there's a particular cause that you really want to promote, that's a great, podcast to start. If it comes from a space of passion, it's always going to be a lot easier for you to jump out of bed and sit in front of a microphone for a few hours and then in front of an editing suite. So one of the biggest things that kind of dawned on me that I didn't realize is the ability that I'd have to connect with people outside of my inner circle when I had a podcast. I remember the first time I decided to do a podcast, it was just a bit of a challenge that I was doing with a mate. And we kind of came up with this idea of like, why don't we start a podcast? And so I put a post on my Facebook basically saying that I'm going to start a podcast. And if you would like to be a guest on it, or tag in someone if you think that would be a good guest. I had no show name. I didn't know what the show was going to be about. But within about 24 hours, I had a list of about 15 names of people who would put their hand up and said, I want to be on your podcast. And I was kind of blown away by that, because I thought, I don't even know what the podcast is about, yet you're willing to be on it. So once I got clear of what my podcast was all about, then I reached out to the people who matched. But what really surprised me is how easy it was to kind of get guests and people to come on board and talk in front of a microphone. I feel like they're actually more likely to talk in front of a microphone than on a video or something that shows who they are rather than just their voice. So if you're sitting there thinking that maybe starting a podcast is too hard because you're not able to get guests or you're not sure about content, people will give you that. I heard someone earlier on today also talk about the fact that asking for feedback on social media, using that to then create your content. So someone asks a question, then you say that I'm going to answer that in my next episode. So really use the method of user-generated content to go out to the marketplace, ask a question, ask a poll, and then use that as a way of creating your content. So I was really blown away with the people that came forward and who I was able to have conversations with. And, initially for me, having a podcast was a little bit of, for myself, I wanted to basically pick people's brains about business and marketing so I could become a bit smarter. But what podcasting did was enable me to capture that conversation. And I always say that once you capture that conversation, it's a beautiful gift to give back to the universe. And so all those conversations that I've had with business mentors and coaches and marketing gurus from all around the world are still online and people are still listening to it today. And I'm very happy to pay the hosting fees because I know that the same way I've listened to someone else's podcast and that was what I needed to hear that day to get unstuck or to solve a problem, my podcast is doing the same. And now I have the ability to help other people have those moments and experience that as well. So it's a really great kind of closed loop on the journey for myself. So I'm very humbled to be where I am today, working with the team and clients that we have. So I guess, during the journey, I made a lot of mistakes. There was a lot of things that we thought were doing good and we didn't. Our initial artwork was terrible. Our descriptions were horrible. Our initial equipment was terrible. So we basically did everything wrong. I remember our first logo had a microphone and wavelengths and headphones and basically every cliche symbol you could think about when it comes to podcasting. And so we soon realized that we were wasting that real estate when we could have had better artwork and much more powerful podcast. So we got rid of intros that we didn't need, and we got rid of outros and call to actions that were repetitive and awkward, and we polished it. So my point here is that we've learned a lot during the mistakes, and so why I started the mastermind and put a program together called the 6P's of podcasting is to just help other people not go through those same mistakes. So if you've downloaded the workbook, you'll see that you can fill in the blanks and kind of give yourself a plan of how to set up your podcast. So let's cover off the 6P's of podcasting. So the reason why I've kind of called it, the fact that you can start a podcast in a day is because you can really learn one item a day and work on that. And by the end of next week, you could basically have a podcast. So if you're up for the challenge, feel free to declare this to yourself. And I always say, go into a public space like Facebook and just let everyone know that you're going to have a podcast by a certain date. In fact, we committed to the universe so much that we actually had a podcast launch event booked in with a venue and people paying to come to this event before we even had our podcast kind of in the work in progress stage. So we really had a hard date that we needed to pull everything together in order to launch our podcast. So nothing like a good deadline. So declare that to the universe and just share it with everyone and say, hey, I'm going to start a podcast and it's going to come out on this date, and work towards that. But the number one thing that we need to focus on, and for day one, you can focus on purpose. So really get a good understanding of why you're starting your podcast. There's a great TED talk by Simon Sinek called It Starts With Why. It goes for about 20 minutes, and he really just talks about knowing your why and having the ability to communicate that really well with people. And once you have your why, that sets the foundation of basically everything you do for your podcast. Picking the topic, the name, the branding, the colors, the feel, the tone, the music. Really understanding your why is a great way of just kind of setting a good foundation and a filter of choosing the right guests, the right questions to ask, the right content, and using the why as a filter is a really solid method that I've found to work many times. And that's why it's really important to know that first. And so that's what's kind of covered off in module 1 or day 1. Module 2, and the second P is the plan. So this is when we basically start planning what the show looks like, what if it's going to be a solo show, if you're going to have a guest in a room, are they going to be remote, what that flow looks like, some of the questions you might ask, how are people going to book with you, are you going to have show notes that are complicated with links everywhere? So this is really when you get to start planning what your show looks like. And the reason why we think about this early on in the piece is because if you're deciding to do show notes, then you need to decide whether you're going to write them yourself. Are you going to write them as soon as you finish the episode, or are you going to wait for it to be edited and then listen to them? Are you going to get your editor to write the show notes? So you really need to know, if you're going to have show notes, what kind of things you need to book and in what order. So just thinking about that. And when people say, like, should I or shouldn't I include these, just think about the way that you listen to podcasts. Like, if you love reading long form show notes to a podcast, then maybe you should create a podcast that has that as well. But if you hate reading long form, then maybe you should create a podcast that doesn't have long form. Until the audience asks for it. Like, I really believe that podcasts should be created for the listener. And if you're appealing to an audience that maybe requires long form show notes, one of my clients runs a farming blog, and a lot of their audiences are farmers and they don't always have access to the internet. So streaming a podcast is difficult. They want the transcriptions of it. So that's an audience that we then do transcriptions for. So their audience wants it. So just know who your audience is and work out what you're going to deliver from your podcast. This also helps you work out how long the show is. Does your audience have a long attention span? Can you do a 3-hour show? Or do they have a short attention span? And maybe a 15-minute show, but more regularly, is actually what they're after. A good way of kind of looking at this is just seeing some of the content that already exists online. Go to YouTube, see other people creating content on the same topic, and just see what they're doing. Normally that's a good indicator, especially if they've got lots of subscribers, of what they're doing. They've basically already done the feedback for you and the research. Day 3 or module 3, we're going to kind of basically go through the platform. So the platform really is, now we know what we're going to do, why we're doing it, where's everything going to sit. And I know we have some platform sponsors for International Podcast Day, and we have our preferred platform programs here in Melbourne and Australia that we like to use. There's no right or wrong, but it's just really understanding what it's there for. Like, some of them have hosting costs. So if you think long-term for your podcast, if your podcast is going to exist for years and years, can you afford to pay those hosting fees ongoing and forever? Do they have a plan that you can put your podcast into, like, maintenance mode? Can it scale? Are you picking a platform that is great for a quick 5-minute show? So, maybe like Anchor or something like that. But then if you're going to do a 40-minute show that requires a lot more server load, are they able to support that? And can you grow your podcast based on the platform you're picking? So a little bit of future planning, and again, knowing why you're doing the podcast can help you understand whether you're going to do a 10-part mini-series or a ongoing show that's going to last for years and years. I know Adam shared this same slide from Wavelength before on the session before me, but this is a good way of kind of knowing, the different parts, the moving parts of a podcast. You've got the episode file, and that needs to sit on a hosting platform. And then that hosting platform will give you an RSS feed, and that RSS feed is basically a simple text file that's super powerful because that's going to be read by Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, all the different podcast apps and distribution networks and directory sites, and all the information is going to be sucked from that. So it's really important to pick a partner that has their finger on the pulse. I've seen a lot of hosting platforms not update when Apple makes some changes, such as the recent episode and season numbers or the new categories that Apple's released. There's some platforms that haven't updated with that, and so it's hard to pick the proper category if the media host hasn't updated. So just think about, have they got the finger on the pulse? And sometimes a small fee for hosting is actually really worth it because they back it up. It's fast, it's efficient. They're updating the platform for you, and you're able to just focus on content. There's nothing worse than having to download all your files and move hosts and things like that. So a bit of planning around where that all lives and how that all sits is really important as well. Day 4 or module 4 is about producing. So this is kind of when we talk about equipment, the way that you're going to set up, some recording tips like making sure that you have water, having pen and paper, having headphones is a really good important part because you don't want any feedback coming out of the computer and back into the microphone. Making sure that your guests don't have bangles and earrings that kind of make clinking sounds or noises in the background from notifications. They can be really distracting and sometimes really hard to edit out as well. The other thing as well is making sure that you have this idea of not comparing your current state to a podcaster who's been doing podcasts for 4, 5, 6 years. It can be very uninspiring listening to someone's episode and then listening to your first episode. So when it comes to audio editing, there is a big learning curve if you're going to do this yourself. And so one of the things that I did early on, and I kind of recommend all my students to do, is go and listen to some of your favorite podcasters' first episodes, just to realize how far they have come, and to just understand that one day you'll come that far as well. And maybe your show will be better. I'm not sure what your goals and your ambitions are like, but it's really interesting to go and listen to some long-term podcasters' first shows, and just realize that they had a journey that they followed to get where they are today. And they might be really polished on the microphone and their shows sound fantastic. They may even have now gotten funding so they can afford good producers and editors and so forth. But if you're going to do it yourself, which is something that's completely doable, and 80% of my podcast is all DIY'd, every week you just learn something new. You learn how the noise reduction filter works. Next week you learn how compression works. But the golden rule is really investing in the equipment. If you can capture audio with really good quality, then that's going to mean that you can reduce your editing time and how much you need to edit, and how much you need to pay someone else to edit as well. So the better you can capture your audio, the less editing you're going to do, or what we call post-production. And also the art of interviewing. That's going to happen over time. Only, practice makes perfect, and the more you do it, the more comfortable you'll become with it. It might even just be storytelling techniques that you need to improve on. It may be interviewing if you're doing an interview show, but just remember that you're going to improve, and not to compare your now with someone else's later state is really important. Then becomes day number 5 or module 5, which is publish. And publish is, the first time you publish your episode, there's going to be a lot of moving parts because you're publishing your actual podcast and you're also publishing episodes. So the first hurrah is really daunting. There's a lot of moving parts. There's review times that you need to wait with Apple. So there can be a lot of things happening. You may want to share it on social media that you're launching a podcast. But as you then start getting into the rhythm of publishing each individual episode, that's going to get a lot easier for you. One of the things I like to just share with people is if you can launch your podcast with several episodes, like don't just have one episode, which is a common thing that people feel that they can do because it's a little bit easier. The more podcasts that you publish with, I recommend anything between 4 and 6 is going to help your distribution because it's going to help with the rhythm. People are going to be able to listen to 3 or 4 episodes and really make a decision whether they want to subscribe and stay a loyal listener. If you launch with just one episode, you're only really giving people that one opportunity to get to know you. If you've got a guest, that might be a topic that doesn't interest them, so they may dismiss the show or your podcast before they even be able to build a relationship. So the more episodes that you can release with on day one can increase the chances of building a loyal fan base early on in the piece. And we recommend Omni Studio, but I know there's other platforms as well. The other big question that I always get when it comes to publishing, and I see this a lot in podcast groups, is whether you should have a website or not. I think having a website on day one of your podcast probably doesn't make sense unless it's easy out of the box. I know at Wavelength we're working on the bow tie, which is going to make it really easy for people to have a podcast on day one because it reads the RSS feed and basically gives you a nice looking website. Some podcast hosting companies give you a website out of the box, but you're limited to what you can turn on and what you can change, and you may not be able to brand it to your color themes. But unless you have a real reason to have a website on day one, there's probably no need. But like anything, the more that it's online and the more discoverable it is, the higher the success of your podcast. So not only are people looking for podcast topics on their podcatchers or their pod players or Apple, they're also using Google. And Google in the last couple of months, I know here in Australia, maybe it's been a feature for Americans for a while, but they're starting to put podcasts in the results of their search engine SERPs, their results. And that means that people can start listening to the podcast right in the player. It means that people are going to Google and looking for problems, and podcasts are now starting to solve those problems. And so I feel like if you want the success of your podcast to be something and it matches the strategy, then having a website could be quite beneficial. Just checking if there's any questions. So that was basically the point on websites is don't create extra work for yourself in the launch phase. Really just focus on your podcast, getting the titles right, getting it discovered on all your different directories. And then once you get into a good rhythm, then you can distract yourself with a website. I don't think it's necessary on day one, but the point I want to make is that it is necessary long-term. Day 6 is all about promoting. I think Adam mentioned this in the previous talk as well, but people promoting their own podcast. And I feel like it's something that we all kind of do in a way, because it's like no one likes talking about themselves, so front and center. And an earlier on talk was kind of like, it sounds a bit spammy when you're kind of talking about yourself and your podcast. But there's a couple of things that we can do. We can ask our guests to promote it when it goes live. Now, if we're going to rely on that as the only strategy, I can assure you that it's going to fail very quickly. Guests are also in that same boat where they feel like their episode and promoting it is a bit spammy. So don't rely on the guests to promote the podcast, because it may not work in your favor. I know that's a mistake that we made. We thought if we make it really easy for guests to share their episode, we created quote cards on Canva, we created tweetables. We basically sent them an email with like copy and paste content for them to be able to just share the show, and crickets, nothing, nobody. And so we're very disheartened initially. So if you just want to prevent yourself from the disappointment, just know that guests will not share their episode as much as you think it will be. So you really need to go into like self-promotion mode. There are some great platforms now like Repurpose, Audiograms. They are great to cross-pollinate your episodes across different networks. One of the things that I did when recording my podcast is I always captured video. The reason why I did that is because I feel like it created better rapport with my guests. It also meant that I was able to capture some key moments on video, which is a good medium to put out onto social media. There's more energy in video. It captures the smiles and the laughter and the fun that can come with podcasting. So if you can be comfortable with it and you can encourage your guests to show up and record via video, you just let them know that it's a podcast and that you won't ever use the video unless it's for promotional. But sometimes you may want to use the video and upload that to YouTube as well, and have another area where people can discover that episode. I found that most guests were very comfortable with it, and it also meant that I had a good rhythm with my guests because we could see each other, which is, 80% of communication is through body language. And so when you're interviewing someone, it's much better to not interrupt them or see that they've finished with the conversation, and it creates less editing and post-production. So if anyone's got any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat. I'm happy to kind of answer any questions that people may have. The other thing as well is, like, money's always in the list. If you've got an email list, don't just randomly wake up one day and send them a podcast newsletter. Did that, got lots of unsubscribes. So learn from the mistakes. Make sure that you kind of prime people. One of the things that we found to work really well was have people buy into your podcast really early and have them part of the launch. Share your artwork early on and ask for feedback. Share the music jingle or the intro and ask for feedback. If you can get people to buy into your podcast before you launch it and they feel part of actually creating it, and they, especially now on Facebook, you can create polls and you can put 3 images up and say, vote for logo A, B, or C, and people are voting. What you're basically doing is you're subtly creating a list of people who are interested in buying into your podcast. So when you launch it, you can go back to those posts and post a link and say, hey, the podcast is now launched. We went with C. Thanks for everyone who voted. And the same with your email list. Like, let them know that you're starting a podcast. You might, send them an email sharing that Facebook post and say, we want your feedback. We're starting a podcast. If it's a little bit more part of the journey and they have buy-in very early, they're going to be more excited to know that you've now launched it than just randomly sending it on day one. And in fact, I would never even promote your podcast being launched on day one because everyone notices the spelling error that you have in your first description. So always do a bit of a soft launch and then promote it really large on maybe day 3 or 4, because then that's when, that's when you're going to get some of the feedback of maybe something's not working or an artwork's not loading or there's a spelling error in one of your titles. Also guilty. And then embrace the power of automation. So use some software that can auto repost things for you. So that way you can do the task once and then it's on autopilot. So we would use things such as Meet Edgar or I forget what all the platforms are called now, but you would post it once and you'd say, repeat this post every 3 months for the next 2 years. Especially if your podcast is evergreen, which means it's not time sensitive and people can listen to it whenever. Embrace automation and just let that self-promote your podcast as well. The other thing is also on the podcast, without sounding too spammy, is just ask for people to subscribe and to share it with friends and family or anyone who they feel like could benefit from that podcast. People do it on YouTube all the time. Subscribe, hit the bell. People are used to that now. And unless you ask, you don't get. So my tip is kind of put that in your outro. Loyal listeners would know that that's what you're going to say. If they've already subscribed, they'll skip that part. And you probably do that as well when you're listening to podcasts. So have it there as something that you can say once to your new listeners. And then once listeners know that you're going to go into your outro, they can skip that without missing any content. Day 7. So that's when you kind of celebrate. This is when, all the feedback starts streaming in, and it probably doesn't all happen on day 7, but it was very overwhelming for me. We had a podcast launch event where we actually launched our podcast, The Razor Sharp Show, and we had people pay to come to this event and listen to a panel of podcasters. And then over the last, the next few weeks and even up until now, I still get people sending me messages randomly, and some of these people that are on the screen I'd never met before podcasting, and they just send like how much that episode changed their life, or how they needed to hear that, or how it was inspiring. And this is really the part that gets me excited, when you get that feedback loop, and you see the reviews come into your into iTunes as well, and that's also quite exciting to get that. But be sure to respond. I always am amazed when people get reviews and the business owner or the podcast host just doesn't respond and acknowledge those reviews. Like, someone's taken the effort to leave you a comment and give you some feedback. So it's super important to kind of acknowledge them and let them know. And also, if someone says like that they give you some feedback, like, don't see that as hating or trolling. Like, see that as an opportunity to improve yourself and improve. Use that as a way of being a better version of yourself. And so I know podcasting, and everyone who basically does podcasting knows that it can be very overwhelming. And that's the main reason why we started the 6P's of podcasting. We used to go around Melbourne and present this in libraries as a free service to the public to learn how to launch their own podcast. And we had quite a few people really embrace that program, because it was something new that libraries we're not doing. And so when we did that a couple of years ago, we got a really good response. And we helped several people launch their podcast through that. And so and then I also ran a masterclass. And the masterclass is a little bit more one-on-one and personal, and they're just small groups. I normally go anywhere from 7 to 10. And that's a good group where I can handle taking people through that podcast journey. And what I've also done is I've captured that mastermind class. And so if you are interested, there is the DIY class that you can basically opt in and buy. And I'm not sure if you could see that on the screen, but it's a bit small, but it's $397 Australian dollars. And it's the program on the left. And so it's the DIY version where you can get in and you can be basically part of my mastermind class, but just as a listener. And there's a 7-week program with some Q&As. And we'd obviously run that over the week when we're doing it one-on-one, but you could essentially buy that and listen to it day in, day out, and do 1P every single day. And by this time next week, have your podcast kind of ready. And then if you wanted to get the coaching program as well, that's the $997. So these are Australian dollars. So they're a lot cheaper for the US. And I'm just reading a question. How successful has email lists to your clients been? So emailing on episode per episode has been really bad. What we decided to do that worked a lot better was to do a podcast digest once a month. And that's because we had a weekly show. And so we had 4 bits of content that we could talk about every week. If you have a less regular show, you could possibly do like a bi-monthly digest, but I really feel like doing a digest when it comes to podcasting, because if you email people every time an episode gets released, people are just going to unsubscribe. It's going to be noisy because that topic may not relate to them. So what I found when doing a digest is that I was able to like select different topics and craft that email in a way where it could pique someone's interest. And maybe I may have interviewed someone who helped how to write your own book, and then there might have been someone who was a LinkedIn expert, and then there might have been someone who was how to get government grants. And so that covers off a wide variety of topics. So sending that out as an email digest meant that I could pique people's interest, and they would most likely click on something and find that digest useful, rather than new episode, new episode, new episode. If you have the smarts and it is part of a business strategy, this is what we recommend with a lot of our business brands and branded podcasts, is to create a resource hub or a space that people can log into, and they need to opt in to get access into this virtual hub. And you put all your resources in there, and that means your call to action becomes really consistent. When you send out an email digest, you can send people to the episode, you can send people to the hub to get the checklist or the downloads or the show notes. That's another way where if you want a lead generation, you can create a virtual space that people need to opt into in order to gain access to all the content. And push notifications don't really work either in my experience. I know there's other podcasters who have done really well. I feel like it really depends on who your audience is and if your podcast is time critical. If you're reviewing a Netflix series, and your episode of the podcast comes out the next day of an episode airing on TV, people want to know about that because they want your spiel on that episode. Something like that, a push notification and an email blast could possibly work. But when it comes to something a little bit more generic, or business and marketing and hobbies and passions, I really do believe a digest could work. So the only thing I wanted to finish up on here is that if you are part of the International Podcasting Day, if you go to staysharpgroup.com/go, you can get access to these programs. And what I'm doing is I'm adding an extra 2 coaching calls to either program. So even if you do the DIY version, you'll get 2 sessions with me to help you through your podcast. And if you do the full program with the 4-week coaching program, you'll get 6 coaching calls as well. So just a little gift for the International Podcasting Days. This is a complete learning management system. If you buy, you'll have instant access and everything's unlocked. So you get access to all the video contents. Each video goes for about an hour, and it's you basically eavesdropping into my conversation with one of my mastermind groups. There's little checklists, there's little activities to do, there's live Q&As. What I've found doing this a lot is the questions are very common and frequent, and a lot of the questions that I've answered in the masterclass and even here today, I'm sure a lot of other people will have along their journey as well. So I think for timing, I've done quite well. That's 46 minutes out of the 50. So I'm happy to answer any questions or have a bit of a chin wag with Dave or anything like that. But that was basically myself and the 6 P's of podcasting. And done right, you basically can launch your podcast within a week.
Ray, good stuff, man. Appreciate it. That is a lot of stuff to digest. I'm glad the International Podcast Day community has you. And obviously we're going to have this in the future on our YouTube channel to kind of digest and everything. And, the reason I threw that question in there with the email list is the more podcast conferences I go to, that's one of the most common questions that podcasters get, because there's this massive push from so many people right now. You need an email list. You need an email list. You need an email list. And it's like, some people succeed at it. Some people don't. Some people really enjoy it. And it's like, they're trying to figure out where their audience really lives and where they want to land. And it's always a conversation that comes up. So I definitely wanted to get your thoughts on that. So that's why I threw it in there.
And I think it's also about quality. People in these marketing circles talk about, money's in the list, but people perceive that they need to have a 10,000 list. I've worked with clients who have complete automated marketing system, have 20,000 contacts in the list, but 300 opens. So the number and the size of your list means nothing. It's really about the quality, the engagement. I'd rather send out to 12 people who open, read, and click than sending it out to 4,000 people and 200 click out of curiosity and not really interested in the content. So I feel like we're in a space where people are decluttering a lot. A lot of people are unsubscribing. So a smaller list that's really good quality. And the same with listeners. You don't need thousands of listeners to each episode. If you ran an event and got 20 people in a room, you'd be pretty happy. So if you get 20 people listening to your episode, you should be happy as well. It's about quality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't remember who I heard this from at one of these podcast conferences, but the individual said, you want people to unsubscribe from your list because you want those people that want to get your content, and your releases and your updates and whatever it may doing, whether it's your shows, whether it's a speaking engagement, whatever it is. And yeah, I think ultimately, it's where you want to be. What are your goals as a podcaster, and where do you want to land within the space? Do you want to grow, like you said, upwards of 10,000 downloads? Are you comfortable with essentially podcasting to a full group of 120 people? It's all about setting those goals. And I think looking back at your 6 P's of podcasting and utilizing those to whatever means that you want to be within the space, I think that's very important.
Yeah, and it's definitely a journey. I've seen a lot of people who get overnight success, to call it anything but that, and they freak out.Ey're like, oh my God, I've got 3,000 people listening to me. And that almost scares them more. So I think if you grow naturally and slowly, it's actually better long-term success.
It's true. Yeah, there is a handful of people that I've talked to in the past, and it was like, I just got this massive bump in downloads, and now it's all of a sudden super real, right? For
Yeah,
them, they're
yeah.
like, people are listening. What did I do that show versus the last show? What did I not do? And all of a sudden it becomes this like complex issue in this idea. And it's like, maybe you just put out some really good stuff. Maybe it resonated with people and try and duplicate that week after week. But yeah, not trying to like overanalyze it, overthink it, just starting to ride that wave and say, okay, this is a start. And what can I do to continue to grow that in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. And just knowing that it's a process, that, you know, it's exactly where it needs to be right now. And so not comparing with each other. And I know that I've experienced that a lot with students, where they'll go listen to one of their competitors' podcasts or a podcast that they listen to, and they want that. And it's like, but they've been doing it for 3 years. Like, how can you expect to run a marathon before you even know how to crawl and walk, you know? So
yeah, it's you got to find your space. You got to find what you want and what are your end goals. And I think individuals like you with your mastermind and your 6P's definitely help people at least get on the right track. And you hit on a lot of interesting things. Like, there's a big debate, you know, right now in the podcasting space about whether you have a website, you know, and
yeah,
maybe that's not what you need right out the gate, but it's something you want to have in the future. It's something you want to build. You want to have your assets in your brand, and you want to be able to drive people to that. But if that's too overwhelming at the start, make incremental progress as far as becoming a successful podcast.
Yeah, I'm curious to know the people who say you don't need a website, whether it's just because it's extra work that they can't do and think that's necessary. But if it happened on autopilot based on just submitting an episode and sucking it all from the RSS and updating everywhere, and there was no effort attached to it, I feel like the people saying yes to that debate would probably increase. And the fact that there are so many, you know, websites out there for podcasters that are clunky, they don't work, the players are different, they're all inconsistent, and it gives people a really bad user experience. And I know that I've been on podcast websites and I can't even change the speed, and I'm like, I'm done, like I'm out, like I'm going to Apple iPod, you know, like it's just easier because I can change the speed. Yeah, it's 2020 nearly, and we don't have an embedded player that's consistent, you know. So it's those little things that we try and solve, I guess, you know, day by day.
Yeah, day by day, service by service, product by product, plugin by plugin, whatever it may be. And you're right. I mean, each, as you hinted at in your presentation, it's all about building rapport with your audience and in making those things accessible and easy for you. And something as simple as changing speed from 1.0 to 1.3 to 1.5 or 1.8, whatever. Is everybody has their own way of experiencing podcast, right? And you may be particular as a producer of audio, but as a listener, man, you have to understand what they're looking for. And I think to your point, when you said, you know, you can't ignore those reviews, you can't ignore those comments. It's about getting out in front, engaging with them, and so that, you know, you can improve your process as a podcaster, but also be able to provide those resources that listeners in that audience is really looking for.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Ray, where can people find you for, unless there's another comment in here. Addie from Podcast Planner says, I love podcast and to podcast because voicing things out is easy for me to communicate. Writing is not my fave, but my email list has grown. Any tips for writing emails that keep your audience engaged and writing isn't a burden?
I guess from my marketing brain, I always find that this community has a lot of loyal listeners, and you may even find that one of your listeners is very happy to write your show notes for you, or transcribe for you, or translate. So we're in a space where you can get user-generated content. I don't really like when someone transcribes a podcast and then tries to create show notes from that, because we speak and read very differently. But if you can find someone in your inner circle that can listen to a podcast and give their summaries or their takeaways and just even dot point that can be a better way of creating written form for your podcast. But even then, if the audience is not asking for it, I know initially we created a lot of show notes and we got them transcribed and we paid for it all, and no one was clicking it, no one was listening or like reading it. So we then realized we were actually just wasting money and time and effort. So really do it when there's a need for it.
Awesome. Well, Ray, I can't thank you enough for joining the International Podcast Day live event, representing yourself, your podcast, Australia. One final place, where can people go to find more about you and what you're doing in the space?
Perfect. Well, Ray Milidoni is my name. You can search that. ray.milidoni.com.au takes you to my website, tells you a little bit about me, my personality tests, links to all the projects I'm working on. Yeah, I just love educating and helping people. So if you've got something to teach me or you want to learn, let's vibe together.
That's fantastic. Well, Ray, once again, from Steve and myself, thank you for joining us. Everybody out there, continue to use the hashtag International Podcast Day, and thank you for celebrating.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave and team. Well done.